Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. I see some people popping in and we'll just give them a second, but thank you for hopping on right on time. Awesome. I see some people hopping in. Great. Okay, we'll get started at 1:01. Just 1 minute delay. Okay, let me make sure this is recording. Looks like it is. All right, it's 1:01. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to our Lunch and Learn. I'm Tori Curbelo, and on behalf of everyone at LifeWay Network, it is such a pleasure to have you here today, especially for this two-part series that we are doing this month and next month that has a focus on humanitarian emergencies. As a reminder, feel free to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A function. I do tend to miss them when they're just placed in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to them as they come. The context for today is that we are in the middle of a pandemic, as you're very well aware, and we have not gotten out. But even beyond that, in recent years, there's just been an unprecedented amount of different types of human trafficking and humanitarian emergencies, a whole slew. So for instance, in the last 10 years, we have seen an unprecedented rise in armed conflict. There has also been just one natural disaster after the other, globally as well as domestically, considering Hurricane Katrina and some of the forest fires out west in California and neighboring states. And COVID-19 is just one of the many diseases that have spread rapidly in the last few years. And with that being said, there's no evidence that these conflicts, outbreaks, and natural disasters are going to end anytime soon. So the question from those of us at LifeWay Network who are committed to ensuring that every survivor of trafficking is connected, free, and strong is, what is the relationship between humanitarian emergencies and human trafficking? How is it going to affect our work, and how is it going to affect the field more generally? So before I jump in, let me introduce myself because it is relevant to the topic today. I'm Tori Curbelo. I'm the Director of Education, Training, and Advocacy at LifeWay Network. My career has focused on advancing human rights in various capacities. I, for instance, have been a briefer at the United Nations on the topic of human trafficking. I also served as a research analyst at New York City's largest family homeless shelter. And I've worked on a variety of different advocacy and education initiatives around human trafficking, promoting fair trade, and children's rights. Before coming to LifeWay, one of the organizations that I worked with was UNICEF USA, which was actually born out of a humanitarian crisis, which was World War II. And I also had served for 6 months as an intern with the International Rescue Committee. So both organizations have a pulse on humanitarian emergencies. And so I'm very hypersensitive to the interaction between human trafficking and disasters around the world. My master's is in public health, so raising questions and challenging data is drilled into my head naturally and is the launching point for the research that I'll talk about today. So for those of you who are new, I know many of you are part of our community here at LifeWay Network, but welcome if this is your first time jumping in on one of our webinar sessions. So for a bit of background, LifeWay is the only provider in New York City to offer long-term safe housing for women survivors of all forms of human trafficking, including labor, sex, and organ trafficking. We also service both domestic and foreign-born survivors. So whether the survivor was trafficked previously or more recently, we understand that the healing process can take a while. And at LifeWay, they're here to heal. We also provide education to the general public, as you're witnessing now. We go to various groups of professionals, from paramedics to law enforcement to hospitals and schools. So if your organization is in need of a training on human trafficking, absolutely reach out to us after this training. We'd like to connect on that. We also ensure that learnings from the Safe House reach the public, and we do our best to ensure that different communities are equipped to identify it as well as prevent trafficking. And the research today is a product of our education program's involvement in strategic learning initiatives. We also engage in advocacy, advocating for various policies in human trafficking. I sit on a number of coalitions and task forces to represent LifeWay's work, including the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition and the Brooklyn Task Force. And I meet with decision makers such as legislators around issues of concern. We also have a program called Wings for Safe House alumni, where they are matched with a mentor, and over the course of various weeks, they're connected in a community and work on goals and life skills. So today, what do we know about human trafficking and crises in general? The answer is not a whole lot. There is certainly a lot of literature about the environment in human trafficking. So for instance, this wonderful book by Professor Kevin Bales, Blood and Earth. If you're interested, I absolutely recommend. It's an absolutely fascinating read. Is a good example of that type of documentation. This book is actually a product of 7 years of research, where he saw link after link after link between ecocide and human trafficking, which is not two areas that many would consider when thinking about one or the other. Like if you think about human trafficking, you're not necessarily thinking about environment, and vice versa. He follows the supply chains of shrimp, jewelry, computers, and other types of regular commodities that we buy on a regular basis. He visits various countries such as Guyana, Eastern Congo, and Bangladesh. And he has a ton of interesting points, such as that human trafficking produces more CO2 than any other country aside from China and the US. Coltan was one of the commodities that he focused, which is used on our technology. And interestingly enough, Rwanda is a huge exporter of coltan, but they don't have any coltan within their borders. So it raises the question of, where are they getting the coltan from? Well, they're getting it from neighboring Congo. And the areas in which a lot of the coltan, you can find it, is actually protected by various park rangers. But that doesn't mean that it's fully protected, because a park ranger can't necessarily protect against armed groups. And so those armed groups are benefiting from the resources that are used into technology found around the world. And then it raises the question of, who are they using? Because it's not the armed groups that are doing the manual labor. It's, of course, trafficked individuals, as you can tell from the topic of today's presentation. Another great example he talks about is the deforestation in Brazil, where again, you see tons of depletion of forests. And at the same time, the folks who are trafficked to support in that, they are very isolated and removed and out in rural areas. So the ability for them to leave, if they did need to leave, is very difficult, because they're out in the forest. And unless they can read the stars or have some idea, how could they possibly journey home? So these are just some of the examples of how you can see an illegal environment breeding different types of illegal activities, both for the environment and both for individuals. So the impetus for the research that I published quite recently was actually brought out of the current pandemic that we're in. So what happened was, I had started at LifeWay probably the first week of the pandemic, no exaggeration. And pretty quickly of my onboarding into LifeWay, we were reached out to by several journalists, concerned individuals, different professions, who all wanted to know what we were seeing in terms of human trafficking. The real question that they were asking is, has human trafficking just dramatically taken off? And this was very, very early into the pandemic. We were still trying to figure out just everyday logistics, as everybody was in their lives. And I was seeing other reports of definitive statistics of dramatic spikes of human trafficking. And so many questions came into my head, because absolutely I could, and I did, when interviewed, I gave what I thought would probably be the case, but I was very careful to note that we do need some time before we can jump to any conclusions. But some of the questions that came up as I was seeing these various articles was, wow, we're in the middle of a pandemic. How did these folks collect data so quickly? It takes time to develop a methodology and to actually collect the information, decide what your research question is. Everybody is quarantining. They're trying to figure out what to do. They're pulling their kids out of school. It's like the fact that they were able to collect data very, very quickly was a little concerning to me. Yeah, there was just some other questions that came into my head, right? I'll just set off a lot of questions that I wasn't really able to answer at the time. And I'll speak to an organization that I think responded really well and kind of confirmed some of these thoughts that I had. So the research question that I had and formulated, and this came several months later after having this experience, was what is the relationship between humanitarian emergencies and human trafficking? And aside from just our assumptions and what we think what will happen, but what does literature actually tell us about the relationship between the two? Especially since we know that they'll continue to happen. What can we say without a doubt? So the relevance of this research question is summed up quite well here. So although it may seem logical that the risk for trafficking increases following a natural disaster, the link is rarely recognized or examined closely. Therefore, there is a need to examine the link between human trafficking and natural disasters. So I will jump to an example right now of why we can't just jump to conclusions and assume that human trafficking will just rise. So there was a cyclone that devastated Myanmar in May of 2008. And at least 2 organizations had received reports about human trafficking increasing in the area that was immediately impacted by the devastation of the cyclone. So they released out statements to the public. One of the NGOs had distributed a fundraising message to its supporters, which advertised for a campaign and generated $25,000. And they indicated that traffickers were searching the cyclone area with the specific intention of purchasing and trafficking children from parents. Later, however, news footage revealed that it would have been logistically very difficult for traffickers to actually prowl the area because it was so badly destroyed and the infrastructure around was devastated. So transportation was very unlikely. It was even hard for the camera crews and the news folks to even cover the devastation of the cyclone. So authorities were concerned. They did look into this, and they were only able to find 1 case of trafficking, and it wasn't even from the immediate area. And just to comment on that, I do believe that the NGOs were well-intentioned, and I believe that they were going off of a mostly correct assumption that human trafficking by and large affects the most vulnerable individuals. So a humanitarian emergency absolutely affects people and makes them more vulnerable. But we can't conclude that for every emergency, as you can tell from this example. It might be delayed, the trafficking might happen later on, absolutely. But to say that an emergency hits and then a day later, so much trafficking is not always quite accurate. So I believe that's where they made a mistake in their judgment. So Polaris Project, I believe, had a wonderful statement. I was really thankful because, again, it confirmed my early thoughts about just speaking to data quite early, even before we have it. So they said, many of you have asked what effect COVID-19 and the response is having on the trafficking landscape. The reality is we don't know and can't know for certain. but we are deeply concerned. Specifically, we are worried that the economic effects of this virus will increase some of the vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to sex and labor trafficking in the first place. Economic need, unstable living conditions, and substance use issues, among others. A few months later into the pandemic, they were able to look at their data set because they actually do have the most comprehensive data from their human trafficking hotline that we probably have access to in the United States. And they were able to compare their reports and calls about human trafficking over a 3-month period to the previous year before, and they saw a 40% increase in calls. But again, they were careful in how they explained their findings and said, of course, this is not definitive. This is what we're seeing so far. This is certainly an indication, but we'll need more information and we'll continue to report out on that, which I think is a very responsible answer. So back to the research question that I had, what is the relationship between humanitarian emergencies and human trafficking? So to just start out, I decided to conduct a narrative review, which is exploratory in nature, no definitive conclusions. Narrative reviews seek findings related to the research question by reviewing secondary sources. Narrative reviews summarize literature around a research question in order to bring greater insight into an area of interest. Researchers have previously utilized narrative reviews to explore human trafficking specifically, as well as related topics such as domestic violence. And although narrative reviews are not as rigorously structured as systematic literature reviews and other types of research methodology, they do hold a critical place in academia, and it would be erroneous to say narrative reviews are always unstructured. In fact, my review, as you'll see in a second, was quite structured. Narrative literature reviews are valued for their expansive coverage of a topic and can lead to further questions, considerations, debates, and ideas for further areas of research. Additionally, as research is rapidly published, there is a need for a holistic assessment of various pieces. Many published pieces may raise similar points and at times may even conflict with one another. Regardless, narrative reviews serve to consolidate and bring different types of literature into one place for consideration. So the keywords I decided to use were human trafficking, armed conflicts, disease outbreaks, disaster, and disasters. The databases I searched were PubMed, PsycInfo, and Google Scholar. The strategy I adhered to was only taking into consideration peer-reviewed studies. The research needed to explore the connection between humanitarian disasters and human trafficking. So sometimes articles will have both words in it, but it doesn't mean that they're looking at the relationship between the two. The search was limited to primary analysis of data, and only articles written in English were included. So here is how you can see visually how my search went. So from the search criteria, I came across 59 articles, 29 from Google Scholar, 29 from PubMed, and 1 from PsycInfo. I removed all duplicates, so only 44 articles remained. And then I had to exclude articles that didn't meet the search criteria. So for instance, I removed articles that were not related to the research question, articles that didn't examine primary data, such as literature reviews. And 1 article I found, or 4 articles I found, were not a research study. They were just white papers or just commentary. And again, I was trying to stay to research to make this as, well, not that that's not research, but just trying to follow different studies so that we can stay away as much as possible from assumptions and just expert opinions. So we're not recirculating assumptions, just to be extra careful. So in regard to natural disasters, 4 articles in this narrative review discuss the relationship between human trafficking and natural disasters. So Jenny 2 examined the impact of human trafficking after a disaster hits, specifically investigating if the quality of government, QOG for short, serves as a moderating factor. QOG is the ability for a government to provide security, resources, and goods for its citizens. And as an emergency can hinder the quality of government, to hypothesize that human trafficking could become more prevalent as more individuals migrate to receive goods elsewhere and become trafficked in this pursuit. In addition to quality of government, she used an additional 3 indicators, including government effectiveness, rule of law, and political corruption. All 4 indicators are overlapping, but they also are slightly different. And she employed the method of ordinary least squares, OLS, with a multivariate regression to examine the relationship of natural disaster, quality of government, and human trafficking. Her data came from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, 2006 report on trafficking in persons, the global patterns, and the emergency events database. She used the EMDAT data from countries that were hit by a natural disaster in 2016. Her findings were that disasters do appear to impact human trafficking outflows, but quality of government was not a significant moderating factor. She did not rule out that quality of government can have an impact on human trafficking flows independently from natural disasters. So potentially quality of government can affect human trafficking, but independently from natural disasters. And that would have to be looked into from separate research. Gabriela Boria explores the likelihood of human trafficking outflows occurring after a natural disaster, very similar to the last study. She also employed a similar regression. Her study used data from the US Trafficking in Persons Tip Report of 2013, which provided information on 120 countries. She found that the probability of human trafficking outflows increased by 30.4% after a natural disaster. And she also took into account economic factors such as GDP, the employment rate, and trade shares of GDP. She found that the devastation to a nation's economy is positively associated with an increase in human trafficking. So both authors asserted the need for subnational analysis to uncover what drives the relationship between natural disasters and human trafficking. So they looked, of course, over the course of various different countries, but drilling down on countries specifically to find out what the drivers are could offer more insight into these findings. One case study in this review by Catherine Olson-Flate conducted semi-structured interviews with practitioners and government officials in Nepal after the 2015 earthquake struck. The research applied the pressure and release model to explain how root causes exacerbated situations of trafficking while drawing on evidence from her interviews with practitioners and her own experience. The professionals interviewed by the author noted various reasons why they believed human trafficking increased after the disaster. One overarching theme in the observation made by interviewees was the increased demand for work due to a recently disrupted economy. After the earthquake, individuals were more frequently approaching families claiming to be or know of aid workers, educators, and religious figures. And the absence of job opportunities in the aftermath of a disaster also led to an increase in migration. At times, children fled in search of work without their families or with a peer. Lastly, the interviewees reported noticing more child marriages. These unions were arranged by parents with the hopes that such marriages would create a secure future for their children. So these observations of increased migration, child marriage, and demand for job opportunities noted by the professionals interviewed are consistent with general risk factors of human trafficking. Okay, so that was all those articles focused on natural disaster. I had one show up that focused on both natural disaster and conflict. And this one was interesting. So the 2019 article hypothesized that nations with high intensity conflict and natural disasters are more likely to experience human trafficking. The author looked into various types of trafficking, including debt bondage, labor exploitation, commercial sex, involuntary domestic servitude, children in armed conflict. And interestingly, So she actually found an inverse relationship between civil war and human trafficking. The relationship was positively correlated if the civil war and natural disaster occurred within the same year, but just for civil war and trafficking, it was an opposite correlation, an inverse correlation, which is actually the only article in my review that showed kind of that one is not directly related to the other, which I think goes counter to what many would assume. Okay, and then the last article that made it through the search criteria was focused on human trafficking and outbreaks. So the research was conducted by Catherine Norstop, and she conducted a logistical regression using the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Human Trafficking Indicators datasets. She examined factors such as countries, specifically examining source countries, and the rank of trafficking from low to high intensity, and whether or not an outbreak occurred. Her findings point favorably to the possibility that disease outbreaks lead to heightened instances of human trafficking. However, it's not clear why human trafficking is heightened around outbreaks and which risk factors are heightened. The article demonstrates that outbreaks are associated with trafficking outflows, but what are the specific mechanisms driving the relationship? One possibility is that the outbreaks can cause or amplify several socioeconomic and policy-related trafficking risk factors, including economic hardship, the lack of economic opportunity, weakening family ties and structures, stigma and isolation, and the diversion of government resources away from trafficking prevention activities like border control, corruption control, and the rule of law generally. Further research is needed to strengthen the assertion that the specific risks she mentioned are at play, or if there are other factors independent of those that have no effect. So several of the studies that I talked about explore potential moderating variables. A moderating variable is a variable that can explain the strength between two given variables. In this case, those two variables were human trafficking and humanitarian emergencies. A few of the studies in the review attempted to explore the possibility of additional variables that could be potential moderators. So for instance, Jenny Tu's article, which looked into the quality of governments, and then Rout investigated regime type, and Boria explored economic indicators. So they looked to some additional factors there that might help explain the relationship a little better and why there might be some correlations consistently through all of these articles. And a lot of the authors suggest looking into other types of moderators, such as prostitution, internal and external conflicts, and gender. So some of the gaps and what further research should try to look into is one, a lot of the articles conducted cross-sectional analysis, and cross-sectional studies cannot establish causality. There's a potential, for instance, for the outcome human trafficking to have occurred before exposure to humanitarian disaster. And we can't control, as researchers, it would be unethical to start human trafficking. We can't start humanitarian emergencies, so you can't test it. So these are very convenient ways of formulating the research, but it's not conclusive. And just a variety of other types of research methods can portray a holistic picture of the relationship between the two variables and would be needed to assess definitively the impact of various disasters and their effect on human trafficking. The second is what I mentioned before about moderating effects. And while there does seem to be a positive correlation between humanitarian emergencies and human trafficking, with the exception of conflict, of course, it begs the question, what does drive the relationship between the two variables? So having other and future research look into that to paint a clearer picture would be really helpful, and that could be focused on for policy next steps and for organizations as well. And with the exception of one study mentioned in this review, all of the articles utilized cross-national data, with 2 articles utilizing the UNODC's report and 2 using the TIP report. One advantage of using the data sets that they did is that they have the ability to compare the information from country to country. However, there is variance in reporting from each country that can occur depending on factors such as the awareness of human trafficking from country to country, the effectiveness in reporting, and willingness of certain countries to report. They may fear ramifications if they report that they have high levels of trafficking, for instance. As described by one of the authors, the biggest problem in the study of human trafficking lies in not having reliable data at both cross-national and a national level. And that being said, cross-national analysis is a poor test of the phenomenon due to the vast numbers of missing data and availability of data. Additional studies could conduct subnational analysis to complement these studies as well. So I don't just like to have research exist outside of practical everyday life. I think the best research is one that is grounded in practice, and vice versa, practice that is grounded in research. There should be an intersection of the two. So I would like to make some suggestions on what you can do to continue to take action if you're compelled after learning about the connection between the 2 areas. One big way that I would support you taking action is through being a conscious consumer. And one way that I've found helpful is looking for fair trade products. So a fair trade product is one that is audited through one of the main fair trade labels. It doesn't matter really which one, as long as it's one of the more known ones, such as Fair Trade USA, for instance, Fair Trade America, the World Fair Trade Organization. So this one, for instance, is a label from Fair Trade America, and this one is from the World Fair Trade Organization. You would see that on a product, and that tells you as a consumer that there were different values that went into producing that commodity, such as 1, the workers' rights were adhered to, ensuring that there's no child labor on site. They do intensive audits. They work with different farms and co-ops and factories to minimize their risk. So if they do find it, for instance, it does happen. These issues are very difficult to eradicate. They work with the factories and co-ops to figure out how they can begin to reduce that and take steps so that they can hold on to their audit. The other principle that's important is the rigorous environmental standards. So there's a lot of care for the environment that goes into fair trade principles, such as not using GMO products, crop rotation, reducing water usage. These are just some examples, especially because issues like climate change, the folks that see it first are farmers, right? They're some of the most front line in seeing the effect of climate change and degradation of the environment, because they're responsible for getting to us the food that we need. So farmers and farm workers. And so there's a lot of other principles that go into the idea of fair trade. But what I like is that it's all encompassing, right? So you don't just think about human rights and not think about community aspects or the environment and vice versa. It's important to think of it holistically. And when you see that on a product at a store like coffee or tea, you know that there's a lot of attention that gets placed into making sure that that's the conditions under which your product was produced. So I'm absolutely a resource for fair trade. I did a long fellowship with fair trade campaigns, and I love answering questions about fair trade. So absolutely reach out about any questions about that. Okay. So this is a video taken from one of our safe houses just a few weeks ago, and this was just when the water started pouring in. So as you're probably aware, the recent storm affected one of our safe houses. So we do urge you today to contribute anything that you can. We also have an Amazon wish list that you can locate on our website in the ways to donate section under in-kind goods. We are always looking to ensure that we're ready to go and supply the goods that we need to the women. So I don't want to give too much away about how the storm affected the safe house, because we do have part 2 of this series next month, which focuses on the impact of the storm, but also the resiliency and how we have been managing this ongoing issue and what we think for the future as well. So I won't speak too much to it right now, but the purpose of this was just to give a general overview of human trafficking emergencies. What do we know today? And then the next one is, how does it affect LifeWay Network in particular? So with that, thank you for joining us and supporting our mission. Let me see if there are any questions in the Q&A. Feel free to drop any before I go, and absolutely feel free to take my email address on the bottom. It's tcurbelo@lifewaynetwork.org. I'm a resource for any questions. Definitely reach out to us at any point. Or if you need a training at your corporation, at your school for a class, you belong to a church, we'd love to come. Okay, I do see a question. What can we do to regularly support survivors ahead of the ongoing crisis or disasters? That's an excellent question. So one of the best ways you can support people is preventing, right? Prevention is one of the best ways. We don't want to wait for a crisis to happen before we are quick to act. So I do think that, for instance, fair trade is very preventative, because we don't want to wait for the environment to already be degraded before we support folks, right? So I think a lot of what fair trade tries to do is take that preventative route, is support the workers of today and support the environment of today and support communities of today before anything happens. So I think that's absolutely preventative. I think also we need, even though I started this research, what it shows is that there's a lot more research that needs to go into supporting the interaction between the two. So making sure, I think for now, what we can definitely conclude is that definitely more emergencies are going to happen. So supporting organizations like LifeWay Network and many similar other wonderful ones in the field, such as our partners that you can find on the site, supporting them with any infrastructure needs that they might have. So for instance, the funds that we're trying to raise for our safe house, it wouldn't be just to fix the damages. We're confident over time we'll be able to do that, but it's also thinking about how can we best support our infrastructure so that when the next one hits and whatever might happen our way, the sky falls, the floor falls, we can best have a well-structured environment. So I think a lot of the planning that goes into fundraising is also thinking of prevention and future needs and trying to predict that. So I think by supporting human trafficking organizations, you are supporting them, you are supporting potential victims of crises and disasters, especially because organizations, these are the human trafficking organizations in particular, that's where folks will go when they need it. So for instance, when the pandemic hit, the women explained how fortunate they were to be in a place that wasn't going to kick them out. We didn't know as a country if folks would get evicted left and right, and at least the women had a home, and we're like, this is your home until we figure out everything that is going on with the pandemic. So supporting these frontline organizations, you are supporting them with humanitarian emergencies and everything else that might come to be. So sorry, that was my long-winded answer for some of the ways you can think about supporting survivors of trafficking and humanitarian emergencies. Oh, and I think also thinking about global organizations as well, because they deal with a lot of other emergencies outside of the US, so you can support it all, really. Okay, it was a great question. I appreciate that. And this does not have to be the only space for questions. So again, feel free to email me at any time. And don't forget to follow us on social media as well. We need your help in spreading the word about LifeWay. And one of the biggest ways that you can help is having your communities informed about human trafficking so that they can detect it. There was a recent post that came out in the New York Post, an article rather, that spoke about a student who had learned about human trafficking and was able to detect a brothel in New York City quite recently. So you can really make a difference by ensuring that, by sharing LifeWay's content on your stories, by forwarding one of our e-blasts to your supporters so that they can attend lunch and learns like these, so that they are connected with educational resources, they can do so. So bring them into the community, bring them into the fold so that we can support in mobilizing. So with that, we appreciate every single one of you for being a part of this fight against anti-trafficking, in anti-trafficking rather, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one, which will be mid-October. I will be inviting LifeWay's social worker. I'll do an interview since she was very much a part of our efforts to mitigate the storm's effects, and she can speak to our resiliency as well as our work during the pandemic. So feel free to come with any questions that you might have for her. So with that, on behalf of everyone from LifeWay Network, have a good rest of your day.